To be here with you today. If you are visiting with us, I hope that you know that you are our honored guest, and we are so glad that you chose to join us here at Highlands this morning. Before we get into our lesson, let's start with a prayer. God, we love you and we praise you. God, we thank you for this moment that we are blessed with to just dig into your word and to look at what you have to say about us and about your church and about your kingdom and what you are trying to do through all of those things. God, we just pray that as we look at your word, that we can use it to examine our lives, to be honest and open with ourselves and with you, and to leave here energized and ready to make the changes and to do the things that you have called us to do. God, I pray that you will speak through your word today and show us what we need to see. God, we love you and we praise you in your Son's holy name. Amen. So this morning, you've heard this story before. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you. But this morning, I find myself again in kind of a weird place. So I've known that I was going to be preaching today for a while, and I've been working on a sermon. And Thursday night, I was sitting at home finishing up our sermon for this week. I'd already gotten our slides done. I had some really nice, beautiful, good-looking graphics because I like that. And it was awesome. I say it was awesome. I thought it was a good sermon. But there had been something that had kind of been gnawing at me for a while. And I finally, Thursday night, decided I needed to address it. So if you were here about 2 weeks ago, it was 2 weeks ago, I preached a sermon here and I appreciate your response to that sermon. We looked at cheap Christianity and what happens when we do not put the time and focus and effort into our Christianity that God has called us to. And you may remember that I had a couple paintballs up here, and we talked about the difference between quality of paintball, which if you weren't here, that probably sounds really weird to you, but I promise it made sense at the time. Now, after the sermon, I've been preaching for a little while. I preach a decent amount of sermons, and after the sermon, it's normal for people to come up to you and to make comments on the lesson or to give encouragement, and sometimes you'll get some constructive criticism, and sometimes you'll get not so constructive criticism. That happens too. But I always enjoy the time after a sermon because, you see, I focus on a sermon and a lesson. I spend a lot of time developing it in my head and then digging through Scripture and just focusing on it. And what happens as someone who preaches with a sermon is it kind of becomes your baby. And it's kind of hard to really be honest about your baby, you know. So if it's your child or someone you really care about, sometimes you're not the best judge of that thing, right? And so I really enjoy those moments after the sermon when I get to talk to people who have finally heard it, and I get their opinion and their thoughts on it, because a lot of times you guys hear things that I didn't even know were there, you know, or you take insights from what I'm trying to say, and maybe what I was meaning to say didn't really get across, but you heard something that was probably better than what I could have come up with, and so that's awesome, right? And I love those moments. I think they're great. So last week, or 2 weeks ago, after the sermon, I had someone come and share something with me that I had never heard before. It was the first time this has ever happened. This particular person came up and they said, Andrew, I really enjoyed your sermon. It was great. Thank you for that. And then they said something that I've never had said to me before, ever. And they said, but you might not have been harsh enough. And I thought about that, and at first I was like, okay, and we talked about it a little bit, and I appreciate all feedback, and I thought that was great. And I kind of took that and walked away with it and appreciated it. But I have you know, like, that has like haunted me for 2 weeks, thinking through that. And I'll tell you why. I believe that God uses other people to speak into our lives. And a lot of times, and one of the reasons I love that time after the service is a lot of the time, the things that are said to me by you guys are things that I needed to hear, right? You know, I'm up here preaching, but a lot of times I get just as much, if not more, probably more from you guys. And so that thought has been just kind of marinating in my head and my heart for 2 weeks. And so Thursday night, I finally decided to address it, and we scrapped everything and started looking at what we really needed to be talking about today. You see, I don't know if you realize this, but the sermons that I preach aren't really for you. I preach what I feel like I need to hear and just hope that there's some overlap, right? And so as I was thinking about that, you know, 2 weeks ago we talked about cheap Christianity, and that was a sermon that I needed to hear. But I didn't go quite as deep as we probably could have because I didn't really want to examine myself that deeply, right? And so as I thought about that, I was like, you know, there's probably more here. So we're just going to kind of continue from that sermon 2 weeks ago today. If you have your Bibles with you or on your phone or however, you can turn to Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23, and this is a passage that we read part of 2 weeks ago, but I really want to dig deeper into this passage today. So here Jesus is speaking, and I believe that the sermon that he essentially gives here is probably the most dangerous thing that he said in his entire life. In his entire ministry, this was something that he said that was probably extremely dangerous. And honestly, I believe is one of the biggest reasons that he ended up on the cross. You see, here he calls out two groups of people. He calls out the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees were religious groups. Scribes that was really more of a job. They were people who studied the scriptures. They were the people who were supposed to have all of the knowledge of the scriptures. The Pharisees were the religious leaders, right? So these are people that are really well respected, or at least supposed to be, within the religious community for the Jews. And Jesus just directly calls them out. And you see, that's really dangerous because not only are they the religious leaders, but you see in Jewish culture in the New Testament, the government and the church, or the government and their religion, were essentially the same thing. If you had a lot of power within their religious organization, within the temple, you also had a lot of power in the community as a political figure. So Jesus makes some really dangerous statements here, and we're just going to read from verse 1 all the way to verse 28. So if you'll read with me. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples. The scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses. Therefore, do whatever they tell you, and observe it, but don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they teach. They tie up heavy loads that are hard to carry, and they put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves aren't willing to lift a finger to move them. They do everything to be seen by others. They enlarge their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love the place of honor at banquets, the front seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called rabbi by people. But you are not to be called rabbi, because you have one teacher, and you are all brothers and sisters. Do not call anyone on earth your father, because you have one Father who is in heaven. You are not to be called instructors either, because you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for you don't go in, and you don't allow those entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to make one convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as fit for hell as you are. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever takes an oath by the temple, it means nothing. But whoever takes an oath by the gold of the temple is bound by his oath. Blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? Verse 18, also, whoever takes an oath by the altar, it means nothing, but whoever takes an oath by the gift that is bound by his oath. Blind people, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore, the one who takes an oath by the altar takes an oath by it and by everything on it. The one who takes an oath by the temple takes an oath by it and by him who dwells in it. And the one who takes an oath by heaven takes an oath by God's throne and by him who sits on it. Verse 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You pay a tenth of mint, dill, and cumin, and yet you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These things should have been done without neglecting the others. Blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but gulp down a whole camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup, so that the outside of it may also become clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which appear beautiful on the outside, but inside are full of the bones of the dead and every kind of impurity. In the same way, on the outside you seem righteous to people, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Now that is not exactly the most fun read to start our morning, but it's something that I know that I need to hear. See, here Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and to the scribes, and he uses two really powerful metaphors there at the end. He first talks about a cup and then a tomb, and we'll kind of start with the tomb. So one of the, I'm not going to say advantages, but one of the things that comes with being a preacher's son is you get to go to a lot of weddings and a lot of funerals. The weddings were fun. Weddings always had great food. Weddings People tend to really love kids there, and so being a young boy, I used to love going to weddings and running around and seeing all the stuff. And back then I really liked dressing up, so I liked getting my tie on and all my special clothes. Weddings were great. Funerals, as an elementary student, not so awesome. For me, funerals were just kind of weird. I typically didn't know the person that was being honored. I typically didn't know the family, but I would go with my dad, and being there in such a somber environment was just an odd thing as a student. But there was a very specific reason why I didn't like going to funerals. It was because my dad would always be in charge of overseeing the graveside service. And so we would always have to go to the cemetery for the graveside service. I remember very vividly my first time going to a cemetery. I was really young and I didn't know what we were doing, and I show up and here's the cemetery, and there's all these awesome rocks and things everywhere, and to me it looked like an awesome playground. I thought it was really cool, and so I found out really quickly that you're not supposed to climb on the awesome rocks and statues and things at a cemetery. And then after that, when I found out what a cemetery was, all of a sudden I didn't enjoy going there as much. It kind of freaked me out a little bit. I don't like even today being in cemeteries. There's just something for me that I just don't like about it. You think about a beautiful tombstone or a beautiful monument that we build, and on the outside they look awesome, but inside it's a body. And that's always been weird to me. But then he talks about a cup, and I've actually had an experience very similar to this. Being in the Dominican, things get cleaned a little differently than we clean today. Most of them don't really have washing machines, and so everything's cleaned by hand. And they typically, at least in the village where we lived, the people there would typically keep a cup or a bowl or a pan much longer than we would, because they're expensive, right? And so you just keep cleaning it and keep using it. And so there were oftentimes we would sit down for dinner, and things were maybe not as clean as we would want them to be here, except the food was always great, right? And so here we have two cups, and we have this cup that is a really normal-looking, clean cup, and then we have this one that is not so great, right? There's dirt and sand and all kinds of things on it, and this is a cup that we would typically not use. But you see, what Jesus is saying here is that we as people like to focus on the outside. That we as people tend to be a very surface level people. And we do that with our lives, but see, the reality is we care about what's in these cups, right? If we're going to sit down and have dinner and these are your two options, you care about what's inside the cup because you're going to have to drink it, right? And in this cup, what we have is just a lot more dirt. And it's hard to see, but there is just nothing but nastiness in this cup. But in this cup, what we have is just pure water. And you see, I think that if we were going to sit down and drink from one of these cups, that we would prefer the dirt and the grime to be on the outside of the cup and for the inside to be clean. If we have to choose, if they can't both be clean, I think we would choose the one that is clean on the inside, because that's ultimately what we're going to be drinking. What good is a clean cup on the outside if the inside is nasty? It doesn't actually serve any purpose for us. And you see, that's what Christ is saying here to the Pharisees. He's saying, you have put so much work and so much effort into making yourselves a pure righteous. You have put so much work into making sure that you look like you think you're supposed to look, that you've forgotten about the inside. And you see, I think often God looks at us like these cups. Because we look at the outside of the cups and we see one that's really dirty and gross, and we see one that's pretty clean. And without looking inside, I think we would choose the clean one. But you see, when God looks at us, He may see that there's some stuff on the outside that's not great. But this clean, pure inside is one that He can work with. And for us, what happens is we have been called to prepare our hearts for God, to allow God to dwell within us. Because now we don't have a temple, but God lives within us. And so we prepare our hearts, and God dwells within us, and He will do that when the heart is like the clean cup, when it's prepared for Him. And you see, the thing about God is that even though this cup is dirty on the outside, when Christ is in our hearts, when He lives within us, you see what happens is that water, that ever-living water that Jesus so freely offers, it flows out of us. And I think what you will find is that when the water of Christ flows out of you, it's going to end up cleaning the outside too. But it has to start on the inside first. You see, a lot of times, I know for myself, I tend to get that in reverse. When I start thinking about the things that I'm struggling in, when I start thinking about the things that I'm doing wrong, I immediately start thinking about what I need to change, and my heart is typically not the first on the list. I start looking at all the things on the outside that I need to do differently, but the reality is that if we focus on the heart, the outside will eventually come with it. You know, I believe that we as an American culture have just become very focused on outside things. You know, we have. I remember growing up, I don't know that this is something I've ever really shared before, but growing up, towards my high school years and on into college, I really struggled with anxiety. And one of the things that I struggled most with my anxiety was how I dressed. Where literally I would stand in front of the mirror and just look at what I was wearing, and my roommate hated this because I would pull out every piece of clothing I own and try on different things and try to find the exact right outfit that would work. And you know when that anxiety was the worst? Was Sunday mornings. Because I had grown up as a preacher's son knowing that if I did not wear the proper thing, that somebody would say something to me about that. And so in my mind, it had been instilled that what I wore mattered. And that it mattered so much that for me, it created this anxiety where I now had to overanalyze every piece of clothing that I ever wore, down to my haircut and all kinds of things. And you see, I think we get so focused on that outside appearance. I recently had somebody ask me, it was a student at the school that I'm working at, I had a student ask me, what does a Christian look like? And you think about that question, what does a Christian look like? And the answer is pretty simple, but you see, I think we all kind of have our own image in our head. At some point in the history of the American church, we decided that a Christian had a specific look. And I think a lot of times when we think of a Christian, there is an image that will come up, but the reality is that a Christian looks like Jesus. Period. That a Christian, a follower of Christ, it's right in the name, a Christian looks like Christ. And I think we get so caught up because I think a lot of us have had experiences maybe at different levels similar to me. We get so caught up in looking like a Christian and doing the things that we think a Christian is supposed to do and saying the things we think a Christian is supposed to say. We get so caught up in that race that what happens is we neglect our hearts. And when God looks at our hearts, He looks at us and sees us doing all the things that we think we're supposed to do, but in our hearts are all the things that He never wanted to be there. And so this morning, if you find yourself stuck in that cycle of constantly trying to look like a Christian, or maybe the better way to say that is constantly trying to look like what you think a Christian is supposed to look like, let me give you permission in something. I want to give you permission this morning to let go of that. Because a Christian looks like Christ. A Christian sounds like and talks like Christ. A Christian makes the decisions that Christ would make. And when we allow Christ to be the king of our lives, all the other things will come with it. When we accept the living water that Christ so freely offers to us, it will flow out of us. But we have to be willing to accept that first. And so this morning, I want to ask you to look into your own life. I know for me, I get so caught up in all the things that don't really matter. And I neglect the first step. I neglect the one thing that matters the most, and that is allowing Christ to be the ruler over my life, inside and out. And so this morning, I want to ask you, what does the inside of your cup look like? Let's forget the outside for a second. Because I think a lot of us, we work really hard to make sure the outside's clean. But what does the inside of your cup look like? And does it look like Christ? And this morning, if you examine yourself and you find that maybe the inside of your cup doesn't look like Christ, maybe there is a lot of dirt there. Maybe you find envy or jealousy. Maybe you find greed on the inside of your cup, or maybe you find some sort of secret sin that you've been struggling with for a long time. Maybe you find something there that's not supposed to be there. This morning, if that's where you find yourself, I want you to know that you're not alone, and that we all struggle with that. And I think a lot of times what happens is I choose not to look at the inside of my cup. You know, it's kind of like in our kitchen right now. There's a corner of our kitchen that I just choose not to look at because it's really hard to reach with a broom. And so it's kind of disgusting, right? And so rather than like move the fridge, and I'm responsible for cleaning the kitchen, by the way, rather than moving the fridge and getting in there and getting it done, I've just kind of chosen, just don't look over there and it'll be okay. And I think that's what we do with our spiritual lives is we stay on the surface, and we focus on the surface because we know if we dig a little deeper and if we look inside, we might find something that we really don't want to see. But if we do that, then we're going to end up as a church very similar to a tomb. It's really pretty, and it looks great on the outside, but once you open up the door, it's a different story. So this morning, if you find yourself in that place, I want you to know that you are not alone. And I pray that we as a church will be committed to examining ourselves daily and to working together to live lives that looked as much like Jesus as we possibly can. And I pray that in this church here at Highlands that you never find yourself alone in that effort. I pray that we all are joined together in living like Christ. If you're not a Christian this morning, I want you to know that we at Highlands would love to share with you that through His Word the plan that God has for you. God knows who you are. He knows what you've been through, and He has a plan for your life that is so much better and so much greater than anything we could ever come up with on our own. But whatever your needs may be this morning, I pray that you will come as we stand and as we sing.
As the deer